At 73, Edward Ed Hawkins wasn't a prominent name in the quiet town of Seaview, Oregon, a peaceful coastal place where gentle waves kissed the pier and sea winds swept through the old wooden streets. But for those who saw him each morning, steering his modest wooden boat out of the harbor before sunrise, they knew a part of the ocean's soul lived in that man. Ed wasn't loud, nor one to talk about the past. He never called himself a hero, though his past had been forged in years spent at sea, amidst howling winds across the ship's deck and the echoing sounds of war. After retiring from the United States Navy, he returned to Seaview where he bought a small hillside home with his pension. He sought no glory, no pity. He wanted only one thing: peace. It was that peace that moved him to build his boat, the Seabird, a wooden vessel just under 30 feet long, entirely handcrafted by his own weathered hands. No modern technology, no satellite navigation, no high-powered engines. Just pine wood, waterproof paint, and memories he hoped to preserve with the same hands that once gripped the helm of warships off the Middle East. To Ed, the Seabird wasn't just a boat. It was a companion, a place where he could hear the ocean to drown out the bombs. A shelter whenever old memories unexpectedly returned on sleepless nights. In a town that was slowly changing, where new vacation homes replaced old wooden cottages and strangers came and went like tides, Ed felt like a relic. A living symbol of a world people were trying to forget. A world of resilience, honor, and quiet dignity. To some locals, he was kind old Mr. Hawkins. To the kids, he was the old man who always ties ropes. But to most newcomers, he was merely a shadow, a faint figure passing by in the morning mist. And maybe Ed had grown used to being invisible. He didn't need recognition. His presence on the water was answer enough. Every morning, when he left the dock, he wasn't just checking crab traps or looking for fish. He was living on his terms, in a space he'd built with heart and with the scars left behind from war. Seabird wasn't beautiful, at least not to those who judged by appearance. Its paint was peeling, its frame weathered, and its wooden oars worn down by time. But to Ed, every crack told a story. Every bleached plank held something today's world rarely understood: the value of loyalty, honest work, and preserving memory. In a town where real estate prices had tripled in a decade, where anything old was seen as in the way of progress, Ed Hawkins stood as proof that some things never go out of style: dedication, patriotism, and the way a man chooses to live in honor of his past. He didn't need anyone to celebrate him. All he needed was to place his hands on the helm each morning, drift away from shore, and feel the sea breeze rush through his silver hair. That alone told him he still belonged. That morning, a thin layer of mist veiled Seaview's sky like a silver scarf draped across the bay. Ed Hawkins had risen before dawn, like always. His hands, calloused by time and sea wind, gripped the Seabird's wheel as it slowly glided across the calm water. He had marked the location of his crab pots the day before and planned to spend just a few hours checking them before watching the sunrise. It was a daily ritual, simple yet sacred, like a wordless prayer. As he finished anchoring near his favorite rocky ledge, a low, heavy sound began rippling across the water, a sound that didn't belong here. A high-powered diesel engine roared in the distance, shattering the peace of morning. From the eastern bend of the harbor, a massive white form began to emerge. Ocean's Dream, a multi-million-dollar yacht over 200 feet long, glided forward like a floating palace on the sea. Ed recognized the vessel immediately. He had seen it many times on the front page of the Seaview Chronicle, the town's new pride, a symbol of economic revival. Its owner was Evan Maddox, a young, successful entrepreneur who had purchased a waterfront mansion and threw parties every weekend. To the upper class, Evan was the fresh breeze Seaview needed. But to Ed, he was the gust that swept away everything the town had once held dear. As the yacht approached, Ed raised his hand. His thin arm lifted high, the sleeve of his dark sweater fluttering in the sea wind. "I'm here, watch ahead," he shouted, but the roar of the engine swallowed his frail voice whole. On the yacht's deck, Evan and his friends were toasting with champagne, laughing as if the sky and the water existed solely for their amusement. Not a single glance forward, no signal to slow down, no attempt to veer away. Crack. The impact sounded like a hammer striking the heart of the sea. The stern of Seabird shattered under the yacht's bow. Splintered wood, the sharp snap of pressure, the boat was torn apart by the cold steel hull. Ed managed to leap onto a nearby dock just in time, his knees buckling, his heart pounding. He looked back and saw a sight he would never forget. The American flag, which he had hung on the stern for over 40 years, being dragged into the swirling water, torn and sinking beneath a froth of white foam. Everything fell silent. The engine died. Then a voice rang out from the yacht's deck. "Just an old fishing boat. It's not a big deal." Evan said it with a trace of annoyance, tinged with disdain, then raised his glass and drank. The entire harbor froze. A few morning joggers stopped. Marina staff turned their heads. Phones went up, recording, but no one stepped forward. No one extended a hand to the old man collapsed at the dock. The harbor police simply watched, one hand gripping a notepad, murmuring, "There'll need to be a report." Ed paid them no mind. He walked to the water's edge, his legs trembling with pain. He bent down slowly, shoulders quivering with each lap of the tide, and picked up the soaked scrap of fabric, his flag. He held it to his chest, gently, as if embracing a fallen comrade. In his eyes, there was no anger, only a grief so deep, no one dared look for too long. From atop the deck, Evan laughed again. "Maybe it's time for a new boat, old man. Everything has an expiration date." Ed said nothing. He simply stood, though his back had long been bowed by time, and turned to walk away, the wet flag clutched tightly in his arms. No one stopped him, no one offered comfort, but in the hearts of those watching, the moment left a lasting wound, because we all understood something sacred had just been crushed, not just by steel, but by indifference. The video capturing the moment Seabird was destroyed spread across social media in just a few hours. A jogger that morning had uploaded a short clip. The clip hit TikTok just a minute long with a simple caption, "Boomer boat goes boom." Within hours that morning, the views skyrocketed. Laughing emojis, mocking sound bites, a flood of sarcastic comments poured in under the video. "That old man should just retire. That boat looked like trash anyway. Sucks to be him." End of Welcome to 2025, Grandpa. No one asked who the man was. No one paused to wonder why he clutched that torn American flag so tightly as he walked away. And no one noticed the old scars peeking out from beneath the frayed sleeve of his sweater. When Ed returned to his small wooden house on the hill, the one he'd bought nearly 40 years ago with his military pension, he sat quietly at the kitchen table. On the table was an old wooden box, worn smooth by time, holding memories no camera could ever capture, medals never displayed, photos of fallen brothers, in arms, a few handwritten letters still dusted with age, and a neatly folded flag pristine, never flown, given to him the day he retired from the United States Navy. His grandson Jason, a second-year marine engineering student, had just come home from college. His eyes were lit with anger he could barely contain. "You're going to sue, right? That guy has to pay. He wrecked your boat." Ed didn't answer right away. He quietly took out the folded flag from the box, his hands slowly tracing the silver-stitched stars. His voice was low and calm, like a wave retreating into the dark sea. "He didn't crash into me. He crashed into something nobody cares about." Jason went silent. In that moment between the old and the young, no more words were needed. Only the quiet truth hung between them. That sometimes the deepest loss isn't about what's broken, but the feeling of being left behind, forgotten, without grace. In the journey log Ed had kept for 40 years, tracking sea conditions, wind directions, and daily crab counts, he wrote one line before closing it. "First day without Seabird. No one mourned, but I still hear the sea calling." Meanwhile, social media kept spinning. Local news outlets dismissed the event as a minor boating incident. One television broadcast even praised Evan Maddox for owning the largest private yacht ever to dock in Seaview. Not a single sentence mentioned the wooden boat that was crushed. Not a word about the veteran who had lost his last place of refuge. Online, Ed's video kept circulating, just another scrollable piece of entertainment. The people laughing underneath the clip had no idea he'd once saved a team of sailors from a smoke-filled engine room. To them, he was just an old man past his time, a fading period at the end of Seaview's race toward modernization. But when the last of that generation is gone, who will remember how to tie a rope strong enough to hold a boat through a storm? Who will pass down the stories not found on Wikipedia, not printed in textbooks, but that once saved hundreds of lives? No one said Ed had to speak. But in truth, he already had, simply by walking away, cradling the torn flag, eyes unbowed, heart free of bitterness. In a world where every emotion can be twisted into views and reaction buttons, he chose silence, the kind of silence loud enough to make a nation stop and listen. One day after the collision, Seaview returned to its normal pace. Or at least, the appearance of normalcy people wore like a cloak to forget the things that made them uncomfortable. The local news stayed quiet. No mention of the crushed wooden boat. No mention of the veteran who left the dock, soaked flag in his arms, like a drifting ghost. Online, the video of the crash continued to be shared, but no one spoke of the man in the footage. Everything seemed to dissolve into silence, as if what happened yesterday was just a faint dream, unworthy of thought. Only Ed Hawkins remained unchanged, still rising early, still sitting in his old wooden chair on the porch, a cooling cup of coffee in hand. His eyes gazed out across the bay, the place that had once been his second home. But today, the sea felt hollow. The water was still as glass, and the pale morning light blended with the mist, blurring the line between sky and ocean. And then the sound broke through. 3 long, low blasts echoed deep, resonant tones, like ancient voices rising from the heart of the sea. It wasn't the sound of a yacht, nor the usual noise of the civilian harbor. It was the call of the deep, the sound of the military. Ed stood up at once. His face, no longer marked by sorrow, shifted to sharp alertness. In the Navy, he had heard those tones before, not warnings, but signals of something significant on the horizon. From the thinning fog, gray shapes began to emerge. At first, they were just shadows. Then, gradually, the outlines sharpened. 6 Navy vessels, massive, cold, commanding, moved in perfect formation, slicing through Seaview's fragile morning calm with precision and force. No sirens, no festive flags, no announcements. Only the American flag, lowered to half-staff on each ship, a solemn military gesture of remembrance and respect. The news spread faster than the fog could clear. Town residents, from fishmongers and cafe owners to school children walking to class, poured toward the harbor. They stood shoulder to shoulder in silence, their eyes fixed on the ship's docking with an air of reverence rarely seen. As the lead vessel, a guided missile destroyer, docked at the main pier, a figure stepped off. It was a woman, dressed in crisp white uniform, standing tall with perfect posture. Her gray hair was neatly tied back. Rear Admiral Sarah Mitchell. Her face showed no emotion, but her eyes held a solemn gravity rarely seen. In her hands was a folded American flag shaped into a precise triangle, sharp at every edge, the kind only given during military remembrance ceremonies for the fallen. The crowd was absolutely silent as she walked forward, and then, without warning, she stopped, right in front of Ed Hawkins. The man in the worn shirt and faded khakis suddenly seemed smaller than ever, surrounded by polished uniforms and the watchful eyes of hundreds. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hawkins. She spoke clearly, steadily, her voice cutting through the harbor like a ceremonial drumbeat. Permission to come ashore. To perform a ceremony in your honor. No one quite understood what was happening, but everyone felt it. This wasn't about a broken boat anymore. It was the voice of a collective that had not forgotten, of people who still carried the values of honor and gratitude. As Rear Admiral Sarah Mitchell finished her words, a strange, reverent stillness swept over the entire harbor of Seaview. Standing before her was Ed Hawkins. Thin, weathered, dressed in nothing more than everyday clothes. His sun-worn face and moist eyes spoke more than any metal could. But to those who had just heard her speak, he was no longer that old man who sails in the morning. He was the silent hero who had kept quiet for over 40 years. Rear Admiral Mitchell did not look at Ed as she recounted the past. She looked at the crowd, so they might finally see the man they had once overlooked. She told the story of a stormy night aboard the USS Portland. When the cooling system failed during the squall, a toxic gas compartment began to leak. The entire automated system shut down. If the valves weren't closed manually, the gas would reach the sleeping quarters, where 103 young sailors lay unaware. And in those final minutes before disaster, one man charged into the breach. Without hesitation, without waiting for orders, that man was Senior Chief Petty Officer Edward Hawkins. She continued. He turned the valve with his own hands. He suffered burns across 60% of his body. And when they pulled him out, barely breathing, he whispered only, "Look after the boys, I'm fine." He refused all honors, refused the medal, even declined the special veteran disability benefits. He asked for one thing, that those who didn't make it home would be remembered. And then he quietly disappeared from the records, settling in a harbor town, building his own boat, living with the wind and the waves, never mentioning what had happened, to be remembered. And then he quietly disappeared from the records. settling in a harbor town, building his own boat, living with the wind and the waves, and never speaking again of what had happened. Now, all eyes turned to Ed. Someone silently removed their glasses. Another bowed their head. Tears fell not from pity, but from shame. Then, a young sailor stepped forward, holding a bronze plaque that had been removed from a decommissioned ship. Etched into it were the words, "To the man who kept the sea safe even after service. The U.S. Navy remembers." Ed accepted the plaque like someone reclaiming a part of their honor. Not the kind shouted for, not demanded through protest, but the kind quietly preserved, like a lighthouse, small and steady, standing against a vast ocean. Rear Admiral Mitchell continued, "Yesterday, your boat was destroyed. No one helped. No one spoke up. The flag you once protected sank into the water. But today, we are here to say that will not be forgotten." There was no chant, no applause, but hundreds of people stood up, raising their right hands to their brows. A silent salute, solemn and full of meaning. A small child beside his mother looked up and whispered, "Mom, why are they saluting him?" The mother gently squeezed her child's shoulder and answered, "Because he did the right thing when no one was watching." That day, the harbor didn't just witness a ceremony. It witnessed a collective awakening, a town being forced to confront the truth. They had once turned their backs on a hero who lived quietly among them. And in the soft, late morning light, with gentle waves lapping at the dock's edge, Seaview began to change. From silence to the first whispered words of gratitude. That morning, the waters of Seaview were still, but hearts had begun to stir. After a tribute with no fanfare, no trumpets, only pure reverence, something in the town felt cleansed. The indifferent glances were gone. The eyes that once looked away now turned toward the veteran, with a respect they had never known how to show before. Ed Hawkins didn't say much. He never needed eloquent speeches. But the way he stood straight when receiving the plaque, the way his eyes lingered on the carefully folded flag, the slight nod he gave when young officers saluted him, it all spoke louder than words. It was his silence that made people reflect. A little girl who used to pass him every morning on her way to school now stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. The owner of the fish shop, the same man who once complained that Ed's boat was taking up space, walked over that day. He said nothing. He simply placed a warm bag of bread in Ed's hands. The awakening spread like a summer sea breeze, quiet, gentle, but deeply felt. Longtime residents began sharing stories they'd only half remembered about Mr. Ed, that he always cleaned up floating trash in the harbor each morning, that he once taught local kids how to tie secure knots to hold boats steady in high winds, that he had never skipped a single safety inspection in over 40 years. But perhaps what truly woke people up wasn't his past. It was the way he embraced loss. No anger, no demands, just the quiet act of retrieving a torn flag from the water and holding it like a treasured memory. Not long after the ceremony, the town council held an emergency meeting. For the first time in years, every member was in full agreement without a vote. A memorial would be placed at the old mooring spot of the Seabird, a simple stone marker. But carved into it were words that made everyone who passed stop and read, "Seabird, the boat that carried memories, guarded the sea, and held a soul." People began to grow kinder. The fishermen, once overshadowed by the wave of tourism, were now greeted by name. Children were no longer hurried away when they approached old men by the docks. Instead, they gathered in little groups, listening as Mr. Ed told stories about how to read the wind, about how to feel the change in currents, not with electronics, but with awareness. One afternoon, among that group of kids, a 7-year-old girl named Lily sat beside him, fingers still tangled in the rope she was learning to knot. She looked up and asked with the blunt honesty only children possess, "Are you mad at the man who broke your boat?" Ed was silent for a moment. Then he smiled a gentle smile, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "No," he said. "If it hadn't happened, maybe no one would even remember that boat ever existed." And it was true. The Seabird may have been lost, but from its shattered pieces, something far greater had been reborn. A sense of respect, a spirit of gratitude, and a longing to preserve the values the world once deemed outdated. The sea does not speak, but it always remembers. And when we truly listen, even in silence, it finds a way to remind us. That late afternoon, the sky above Seaview was tinted with soft orange. The last rays of sunlight reflected off the water, shimmering in quiet ripples, like memories gently drifting back to their old harbor. Ed Hawkins sat on the new wooden bench the townspeople had placed in his honor, right where the Seabird once moored, now a resting place for those seeking one still moment in their lives. Just then, a figure appeared at the edge of the dock. Gone were the expensive clothes and entourage. Evan Maddox walked alone. His face looked unsure. His hair was unkempt. In his hand was an envelope. The ever-present sunglasses had been pushed up to his forehead, revealing eyes that looked real. No longer confident, no longer guarded. He stopped a few steps away from Ed, visibly uneasy. "Mr. Hawkins," he began, his voice uncertain, like someone walking across a ship deck in the middle of a storm. I came to apologize." Ed didn't respond. He simply looked out to sea. But the silence wasn't cold. It was still, like the sea when the wind holds its breath. A quiet space left open for a man to face himself. Evan gathered his courage and held out the envelope. "It's a blank check. You can fill in whatever amount you think is fair. For the boat and for the things I said, the way I acted." He paused, swallowing hard. "I behaved like an arrogant jerk. And now, people online are calling me the guy who crushed a war hero's boat. But I'm not here for reputation. I'm here because I honestly want to make things right." Ed looked at the envelope, then gave a quiet shake of his head. "Money can't rebuild what was lost." Evan nodded, saying nothing. No arguments, no excuses. Just the truth accepted. After a long moment, Ed turned to him, his gaze steady and deep. "If you really want to make amends, there is one way." Evan looked up, listening. On the eastern pier, there's a spot. Each morning the sun rises there, hits the water straight on. I used to dock there sometimes, when I needed a little more quiet than usual. Ed paused, then continued. "Put a bench there. Good wood, solid, and carve 3 words into it. Sit, remember, be grateful." Evan furrowed his brow. "That's it?" "That's it," Ed nodded. "Sometimes what people need isn't money, but a place to stop and think about what really matters." 2 days later, a carpenter was brought in from Seattle. Evan helped install the bench himself, barehanded, no gloves. By the end, his palms were blistered. Work they had never done before, now etched into them. When it was finished, the bench stood quietly by the dock, facing the spot where the sun rose over the water each morning. Facing directly toward where the sun rises, the bench stood quietly. Engraved on a bronze plate words that would tarnish over time, but never fade. Sit, remember, be grateful. The story spread not because Ed accepted money, but because he never needed anything at all. Just for people to stop, to remember, and to be grateful. Evan left that day without saying another word. But from then on, people often saw him at the Eastern Pier, sometimes just sitting for a while. No phone, no company. Perhaps he was beginning to learn something money had never taught him. Humility. A month after the ceremony that had shaken the entire town, Ed Hawkins's life gradually returned to its peaceful rhythm. But it was no longer lonely. Each afternoon, people would find him sitting on the wooden bench at the Eastern Pier, the one with 3 words now etched into memory for all who passed. Sit, remember, be grateful. He no longer sailed out to fish, but he still rose early, still came to the dock. And now, he came to teach local children how to tie lines, how to read the tides, how to listen to the sea. It was no longer a thing of the past. It had become a living legacy, a passing of values no technology could ever replace. One soft sunny morning, an old pickup truck pulled up to the dock. Out stepped Rear Admiral Sarah Mitchell. This time, with no uniform, no flags, no honor guard. She wore a plain white shirt and jeans, and approached Ed with a warm, familiar smile. "I'm not here to honor you this time," she said. "I'm here to offer you something." She explained that the Navy was expanding a program called the Youth Maritime Leadership Program, a place where teenagers would learn seafaring skills, navigation, marine conservation, and naval tradition. They need someone who's lived with the sea, not just to teach the techniques, but to inspire. And I can't think of anyone better than you. Ed smiled faintly, part declining, part considering. "I'm a 73-year-old man, scarred head to toe, and I don't have a teaching certificate. But you have something they don't," she cut in gently. "The heart of the ocean. in a generation that desperately needs to be taught with the silence and dignity you carry. Ed didn't reply right away, but when his eyes drifted out to the dock, to the new boat moored there, the one named Seabird, rebuilt by his grandson and the community from the original plans, everyone knew he would say yes. That afternoon, he stepped aboard. His frail hands brushed along the polished wood. A fresh American flag flapped at the bow. A child ran up, calling, "Mr. Ed, can you show me how to read the wind?" He turned, eyes glinting like the ocean under sunlight. "Sure, I kid, but not with your eyes. With your feeling. Stand still and listen." On the bench by the dock, a young family sat, reading the words engraved in brass. The child looked up and asked, "Daddy, why does it say sit, remember, be grateful?" The father answered softly, "Because some people kept us safe, even when they asked for nothing in return." When this story ends, we don't just remember a broken boat and an old sailor. We remember quiet resolve, silent kindness, and the belief that true values never really disappear. They just wait for the right moment to be heard. Ed Hawkins needed no titles, no compensation. He only needed a place where others could sit, reflect, and give thanks. The harbor at Seaview will change. The world will move on. But stories like this remind us, in a world so rushed, so loud, so full of competition, sometimes silence is the loudest declaration of honor and humanity. Never underestimate the quiet ones, because they, in their humility and strength, are the ones keeping the most beautiful parts of this world intact. If you've ever known someone like Ed, tell us about them in the comments. Don't forget to like and share if you believe that gratitude and honor are never outdated. And subscribe for more powerful stories where kindness always finds its voice. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next story.